Hello students, today I'll discuss about one of the principle of India's foreign policy, that is non-alignment. And if you look at non-alignment, basically it was one of the principle of India's foreign policy. And later on, if you look at non-alignment foreign policy becomes global and it becomes non-alignment movement. So we'll discuss this idea, right? Non-alignment and non-alignment movement. Now, if you look at non-alignment movement was a global solidarity movement for peace, world peace and cooperation, right? It was a global movement, right? For world peace and cooperation, right? Now, on the other hand, if you look at non-alignment, non-alignment was one of the principle of India's foreign policy. It is a one of the principle of India's foreign policy. India's foreign policy. Now, question is what this non-alignment is all about, what this non-alignment movement is all about, right? And does India also still follow non-alignment movement or non-alignment foreign policy? That I'll discuss. Now, let me give you some background of this movement and this. Now, if you look at post World War II, post WW2, World War II. Now, if you look at, there was a certain things happens, right? Now, one of the important things was Cold War. Now, look at Cold War. There was a confrontation between the capitalist bloc led by the US. So, there was a US and its allies like France, Britain, right, West Germany, another was USSR, and their allies was like Cuba, China, North Korea, and so on. And there was a confrontation between US and USSR. Further, there was an arms race. Arms race. Now you must know that US has already invented nuclear weapon, and it has also used against Japan, right? It dropped a nuclear weapon on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, right? Now look at USSR also developed it, France also developed it, Britain also developed it. So there was a arms race, and further there was a defense pact, like US formed NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and USSR formed Warsaw Pact. Right, Warsaw Pact came in 1955, right, and NATO came in 1949, right. This was a major event, and meanwhile, if you look at, there was also decolonization. What is decolonization? Decolonization was a process, right? The countries of Asia and Africa became independent from the colonial power. And the major question before these newly independent countries of Asia and Africa was what kind of foreign policy we should adopt. Should we join also either of the group, either the group led by the US, that is called capitalist bloc, or should we join the USSR, the socialist bloc, right? So in this regard, if you look at, right, there was a one, conference in Delhi, that is called New Delhi Conference. New Delhi Conference, right, and it is also called Asian Relation Conference. Asian Relations Conference. This conference was held in 1947, right? Now look at approximately 27 countries participated in Asian Relation Conference, including international organization like UN participated in this. And this in Asian Relation Conference, the Asian countries discussed what should be the foreign policy of the newly independent countries in the contemporary situation, right? So that is important. Now if you look at that is called ICWA, right? Indian World Council Affairs has been also established, right? Now the next is that is called Bandung Conference, right? Bandung Conference. Now Bandung Conference was also held in 1955. Now this time it was a Africa and Asian Relation Conference. The Bandung Conference held in Indonesia, and this time world leaders and Indian leaders participated in this, and approximately 28 countries of Asia and Africa participated in Bandung Conference, right? Indian leaders Jawaharlal Nehru, Ghana's leader Kwame Nkrumah, right? Colonel Nasser of Egypt, Joseph Tito of Yugoslavia, Sukarno of Indonesia, they participated in the Bandung Conference, and they agreed on certain things, right? They agreed on that economic cooperation, that look, the third world countries needs to cooperate on economic front, right? So they believe that economic cooperation is very important among the nation state, and they also believe that cultural cooperation, right? And they also talked about several principles. For example, Bandung Conference has given importance to E1 Charter, E1 Charter, and objectives of UN, objectives of the UN. Then it also basically focused on cooperation, right? It believed in world peace. Then it believed on disarmament, It opposed imperialism, colonialism, racism, foreign dominations, right? These were the basic agenda at the Bandung Conference. And if you look at the principles of the Bandung Conference, the basic principle of Bandung Conference was to support UN Charter and its objective, right? Support the sovereign equality. That means all nation states are equal in terms of sovereignty, right? Then they also focused on non-intervention and non-interference in the internal matter of one another. They talked about that every nation has a right to defend themselves if attacked, right? They also talked about all international disputes should be settled, right, on the basis of negotiation, reconciliation, right, arbitration, or international justice system. right, in accordance with the UN Charter. So they talked about Bandung Conference, and they actually basically shaped the uh, objectives of foreign policy, or one of the foreign principle of foreign policy of the third world. Since world was divided into two power block, two ideological block, the capitalist bloc and socialist bloc. So look at the Bandung Conference and Asian Relation Conference. They basically shaped an environment that newly independent countries will not going to submit its hard-earned sovereignty, and it is going to make a third way of foreign policy, an independent foreign policy, or you call it strategic autonomy, right, to interact with other countries in international politics. And it also focused on 4D. It also focused on 4D. Now, what is the 4D? 4D, one is called decolonization. Decolonization, right? Name countries actually favored the right to self-determination of the all colonized country. जो भी कंट्री अभी तक इंडिपेंडेंट नहीं हुए थे, राइट, उनके इंडिपेंडेंट मूवमेंट को नाम कंट्रीज सपोर्ट कर रहे थे, राइट। ये कह रहे थे कि जो इंपेरियल पावर है वो वहां से चले जाएं और हर कंट्री को एक स्वतंत्र होने का अधिकार होना चाहिए. दैट इज कॉल्ड सेल्फ डिटर्मिनेशन राइट्स. सो दे एक्चुअली फोकस्ड ऑन डीकोलोनाइजेशन. देन ऑल्सो दे फोकस्ड ऑन detente. They focused on detente. Detente means relaxation of tension. Relaxation of tension. Now you know that during the Cold War there was a tension. During the Cold War there was tension, right? And tension between the capitalist bloc and the socialist bloc. So वो लोग कहते थे कि भाई जो नाम मूवमेंट था, नाम मूवमेंट वाज अ ग्लोबल सॉलिडारिटी मूवमेंट फॉर वर्ल्ड पीस. सो उनको लगता था कि आर्म्स रेस नहीं होना चाहिए, तो क्या होना चाहिए? डिसआर्मामेंट होना चाहिए, राइट? वर्ल्ड पीस होना चाहिए. If you look at the 1950s and 1960s, it was a full of tension, right? Full of confrontation, full of ideological polarization, right? And there was a scholars. There was like Secretary of State John Foster Dulles. उनका कहना था कि if you are not with us, you are against us, right? And their policy was policy of containment of the Russia, right? And they formed NATO. As I told you that they formed NATO. US formed NATO, right? And US also supported the other military organizations, defense pact, like CETO, MEDO, CENTO, and so on. What the idea? So if you look at the NAM countries or third world countries wanted detente, relaxation of tension, कि भाई टेंशन ना हो, टेंशन कम हो, डिसआर्मामेंट हो, वर्ल्ड पीस बना रहे. So detente was a major focus for NAM movement. Now after detente, their focus was development, right? You all know that these countries of Asia and Africa were economically backward. Talk about India, right? India's economic growth was 0.5%. Per capita economic growth was 0.1%. The India's literacy was 15%, right? There was a poverty and inequality in India. There was a lack of infrastructure, industrial base, and so on, right? So इस तरह के कंडीशन सभी कंट्रियों में था, एशिया के, अफ्रीका के कंट्रियों में, जो सालों से, वर्षों से गुलाम थे, राइट? तो इन कंट्री का ये था कि वाई वी शुड नॉट मेंटेन इक्वी डिस्टेंस, दोनों के साथ बराबर का एक डिस्टेंस मेंटेन किया जाए, यूएस ब्लॉक के साथ भी, यूएसएसआर ब्लॉक के साथ भी, और दोनों कंट्री से हमें मदद मिले। क्यों क्यों दोनों कंट्री से मदद मिले? इफ यू सी, राइट, by that time, by 1950, US was highly industrialized country, right? It was technically advanced country, right? Economically very rich country. On the other hand, USSR, right, by the 1950, if you look at, USSR was also very much highly industrialized country and very rich country, technically advanced, technologically, and industry very advanced country. So why we should antagonize either of the group or either of the power? So we should not involve in the power politics, and basically we will follow our national interest. And what was the basic national interest? Economic development. Economic development. Right? So they focused on, you know, equidistance, to maintain equidistance from both the superpower. For example, if you look at IITs of Delhi or Mumbai, or industrial center, or Bhakra Nangal Dam, or many other things has been established, right, from with the help of the both power bloc, right? US also helped India, and USSR also helped India in terms of economic development. So economic development was a major national interest of India's foreign policy. That's why India has adopted non-alignment as one of the principle of India's foreign policy. Right? Now after decolonization, detente, and development, right, there was another, right, D, that is called you know decolonization, detente, development, and another D is basically called democracy, right? They followed democracy. But if you look at disarmament, not democracy, disarmament. Now why disarmament? Because if you look at disarmament, arms race was there. There was too much of fight, right? So disarmament was one of the major focus of non-alignment movement. So if you look at the NAM as a global solidarity movement, it focused on 4D, right? Now if you look at the non-alignment movement, NAM, right? The basic principle of NAM was the 10 historical principle of Bandung Conference. The Bandung Conference has focused on 10 basic principles. For example, supporting UN Charter and UN objectives of world peace, not intervening in domestic affairs of any state, right to self-defend, settlement of all disputes through negotiation, right, diplomacy, conciliation, arbitration, right? Then promotion of peace, then mutual respect, then respect of sovereign equality. These were the major principle of Bandung Conference, right? That has become also principle of NAM. And if you look at the phases of NAM, we can divide NAM in 4 phases. One is from 1947 to 1970. That is called first phase. Now this phase was all about evolution, consolidation, and spread of movement. Right? Now look at, during this there was a first NAM summit held in Belgrade, right? So look at this NAM movement, right? Now look at they welcomed PTBT, partial test ban treaty. They welcomed NPT, nuclear non-proliferation treaty. They welcomed it. Now second phase was 1970 to 1980, right? That is called second phase of NAM. And here they welcomed detente. They welcomed detente. And they also raised some issue, like they raised issue of new international economic order, new international economic order. अब बोलोगे सर ये न्यू इंटरनेशनल इकोनॉमिक ऑर्डर क्या है? बेसिकली इफ यू लुक एट इन द पोस्ट 1950 और इन द पोस्ट WW2, एक इंटरनेशनल ऑर्गेनाइजेशन बना जिसका नाम था यूएनओ, और इसके एक बहुत सारे स्पेशलाइज्ड एजेंसी बने. ब्रिटेन वुड्स के तहत इसके 3 स्पेशलाइज्ड एजेंसी बने जिसका नाम था वर्ल्ड बैंक, IMF एंड गैट. उस समय WTO नहीं था. अब इन तीनों ने जो इंटरनेशनल इकोनॉमी को शेप किया, दैट इंटरनेशनल इकोनॉमी वाज बेनिफिटिंग द डेवलप्ड कंट्री, राइट? सो डेवलपिंग कंट्री वाज एट डिसएडवांटेज स्टेज. सो बेसिकली थर्ड वर्ल्ड बेसिकली उन्होंने कहा कि भाई इस इकोनॉमी को आपको रिवाइज करना पड़ेगा, रिफॉर्म करना पड़ेगा. सो देयर वाज अ ग्लोबल सॉलिडारिटी, राइट? और you can see that the global south has raised voice for new international economic order. उन्होंने कहा कि भाई आप इसको amend करिए, आप इसको रिफॉर्म में लाइए. So it was a movement, right, to ensure equitable and just economic system, right? Now look at this third phase. Third phase was basically 1980s and 90s. हम रखते हैं 1990s, right? That was the third phase, and it was a new Cold War. Look at it was a new Cold War basically phase. It was a third phase, and this was a new Cold War. Now, in this new Cold War, what happened? Now look at, there was a tension among countries of the third world, of Asia and Africa, and they basically challenged or resisted the new Cold War, right? And they focused on disarmament, they focused on peace and cooperation, right? And the fourth phase is from 1990 to till 2014, you can say. Now it was called post Cold War phase, the fourth phase, right? इस केस में यहाँ पर क्या हुआ? Now look at, the Cold War ended, and the NAM countries had actually convinced that we want NAM. NAM has become more relevant. So relevance of NAM has been focused, right? Scholars, statesmen, they focused on relevance of NAM, and they argue that the Asian countries, African countries have now more challenges, because पहले तो 2 सुपर पावर थे, अब वो 2 में से एक रह गए हैं, and this one single power has become the hegemonic power. US has become the hegemonic power, right? So there was a more relevant of NAM than ever before. Meanwhile, if you look at, एक डॉक्यूमेंट आया था जिसका नाम था NAM 2.0. NAM 2.0. This document was published by Indian government with the help of the highly talented bureaucrats like Shiv Shankar Menon, Brajesh Mishra, M.K. Narayanan. They were the man who published a document that is called NAM 2.0, and this is very important. And NAM 2.0 basically focused on changing India's strategy in the changing global world. अगर आप देखेंगे, now NAM was a movement in the 20th century. But if you look at 21st century, there was no Cold War. There was no Cold War. And there was a globalized world, highly globalized world. Now, in that context, India had to think about re-strategy, or India has to re-strategize its foreign policy, and that should be based on NAM 2.0. Now, India has to interact with Asia. India has to interact with global powers. India has to interact with neighborhood and extended neighborhood. Now, how India would interact, and how do they secure maximum interest from the neighbor, from the extended neighbor, and from the global power? Now, that was basically NAM 2.0, and it focused on certain key idea. For example, ensuring energy security, right? Ensuring infrastructure, consolidating, India's voice in the United Nations, right? So that was in NAM 2.0. But if you look at after 2014, the NAM has changed. The policy of NAM has changed. Now, if you look at, policy has shifted from NAM to multi-alignment. Multi-alignment policy. Why is it so? Because due to the changing world order. Now look at the Cold War 2.0 has started, and Cold War 2.0 is not our older Cold War. It is a new Cold War. It is a different Cold War, a Cold War between China and US. Now look at, China is a rivalry of India. China wants, unipolar Asia but multipolar world. On the other hand, India wants multipolar Asia, multipolar world. So India had to actually change its policy from non-alignment to multi-alignment. Thirdly, if you look at the, China's assertion, right, in Indian Ocean, right. So India has to shift from non-alignment to multi-alignment policy, and India follows it. The multi-alignment policy. India is interacting with multiple world at multiple level, right, for the multiple purposes, right, and non-alignment is become the past in India's foreign policy, right. Now, so look at the multi-alignment policy, right. This multi-alignment policy is a need of the hour because of the changing international context, because of the, look at the Trump phenomena, look at the, global supply chain, look at the disruptive world order, right. So therefore, multi-alignment is a need of the hour in India's foreign policy rather than non-alignment foreign policy, right. So this is the something that we need to discuss. Today I'll stop here and see you next class. Thank you.